Hi everybody, Mr. Rogers here with the second part of my video lecture series on the origins of the American Revolution. So the first part looked at the four big picture things that start off this imperial crisis that's going to lead to the American Revolution. That's the 7 Years' War, that's the Treaty of Paris of 1763, that's Pontiac's War, and that's these British imperial reforms that we're sitting here with this slide right here, instituted by this man named Grenville. The second part of this video is going to look at what these three specific reforms do and what the initial reaction of the colonists are that's going to lead to this crisis that we're going to learn more about when we dig into the primary sources for the Stamp Act in our checkpoint. Okay, so let's dig right into it. So just real quick, we'll go over what we ended the last video with. The British leadership eventually came up with several fixes for their empire. The first was strengthening the Navigation Acts. The second was the Proclamation Line. And the third was the Stamp Act. So, the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts was strengthening these was the first step towards crisis. So the Navigation Acts were a long-standing British law that was doubled down on after 1763. It declared that any ship built in England, owned by an Englishman, or crewed by a majority of Englishmen was under English jurisdiction. It required that the most valuable colonial products could only be shipped to England. So that means the trees cut down in Pennsylvania, the tobacco grown in Virginia could only be sold to England. Not to France, not to Spain, not to Mexico, not to China, nowhere. Only to England. To make matters worse for the colonists, all imports to the colonies had to come from England. So, on one hand, anything that the colonists made was supposed to be shipped back to England, and anything that the colonists bought was supposed to be bought from England. So even if you were buying French porcelain or French wine, you couldn't do that directly from France. You had to buy it from France, or buy it from England, someone from England who bought it from France. And then if a French person wanted to buy your tobacco, you couldn't sell it directly to them. You had to sell it to an Englishman who would sell it to the French person. So what this does is it prompts a massive increase in English trade and tax revenue. So they're making way more money. They're getting way more in taxes. But it causes colonial resentment and massive smuggling. The Navigation Acts made things more expensive for the colonists because they couldn't buy things directly. They had to go through an English middleman. And the colonists did not like this. They smuggled. They bought, loosies. They didn't follow the regulations. They were smuggling tea. They were smuggling wine. They were smuggling everything that they could around these Navigation Acts to lower costs. Now, the goal of the British after 1763 was to cut down on smuggling and get more people to follow the letter of the law. So that brings us to the second one of these reforms, and that's the Proclamation Line. So the king announcing this was another step towards crisis. And we can see the Proclamation Line right here, and we'll look at it again more on the next slide. So the Proclamation Line. So the Proclamation Line made European colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains illegal. So west of this red line, all the mountains out here, all that settlement is illegal. White people couldn't settle out past that red line. It was designed to protect Native American land claims and really to prevent another Pontiac's War. They really did this because they wanted to prevent another war like Pontiac's War. They wanted to prevent another expensive war with Native Americans, and that meant that the British had to protect Native American land claims. Now, this greatly upset land speculators. That's people who, today we would call them gentrifiers. They are people who speculated on land, who bought land and hoped that they could sell it at a profit. Okay? And land-greedy settlers. Many of white people in Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, they wanted to get access to Native American land by hook or crook, most of the time by crook. All right? And they were greedy for this Native American land. And this law said, nope, not doing that. Can't do it. You're done. And what this did is it left up land claims in the West. Anybody who was a white person who settled out West, their claims on their land, their ability to legally hold that land, was suspect. It was not fixed. It was not protected. And that scared the heck out of a lot of white colonists who were, again, greedy AF for this land. that Native Americans had. And this brings us to the third and most important cause of the crisis, which is the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765. Now, what the Stamp Act of 1765 does is it created a small fee tax for any legal document or printed matter. Newspapers, books, etc. Okay, so anything printed, you now had to pay a small fee, a small tax, like we would call it a sales tax today, to pay for it. You had to pay that tax in order to buy the document. We would call it a sales tax today, basically. All right. This was meant to pay for the army in America. Now, the idea of a Stamp Act was not an innovation. It was not new. Britain had had one for a long time. And the colonies, Virginia, Massachusetts, they had sometimes imposed their own before. So there was nothing new about a Stamp Act. Everybody knew how a Stamp Act worked. Everybody knew you bought a newspaper, it had to have a stamp on it, or it was illegal. You wanted to get a marriage certificate, you had to get a stamp on it, or your marriage wasn't legal. Any legal document or printed matter, it had to have a stamp on it. Everybody knew how this worked. But what was new about this was this was the first time that the British had directly taxed their colonists in North America. So what was new about this was that this was the first time that the British had directly taxed their colonists in North America. This money was not going, from rural Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, or from rural rural Massachusetts to Boston, or rural Virginia to Williamsburg. No. This was going straight to London, straight to the British, and that was new. So what was the reaction of the colonists to all this change? It was not a happy one. They were angry. FAF. Look at this, like this guy right here. And why were they angry? Well, resistance focused on political and economic issues, particularly the Stamp Act. Stamp Act taxes had to be paid in hard currency, which was rare during the 7 Years' War economic downturn. So the economy was down when these taxes were imposed. It was hard for people to pay for them. And of course, when you can't pay a tax, you're going to really, really hate it. If you are already in a tough economic time and the government is taking more money out of your income, you're going to get upset. Or at least a lot of people are going to get upset. And that's exactly what happened here. So colonists also had a deep-seated tradition of self-rule since their government had largely been ignored by the British. Before this period, the British, except for some key instances that we don't need to worry about for this class, hadn't really cared very much about how the colonists governed themselves. They hadn't imposed taxes on the colonists. They hadn't really bothered with exactly how the colonists ran their societies. As long as they followed the same rules, and when the British said go to war, they went to war, the British largely were hands off. We call that benign neglect. That is saying that it was a positive neglect. We're neglecting you because we think it's what's best for you. Well, that benign neglect was gone from this point. From this point on, the British were very interested in what was going on in British North America. They wanted to extract money to pay for all the things that were happening after the 7 Years' War, after the Treaty of Paris, after Pontiac's Rebellion. They were really interested in what was going on with the colonies. And that's going to lead to a lot of resistance. And we're going to learn more specifically about what form of resistance that took when we dig into the checkpoint's primary sources, checkpoint 1's primary sources about the Stamp Act. But until then, please compare this against your study guide. Make sure that you've answered all the questions there. If you have any further, if you haven't watched part 1 of this video, please feel free to go back and look at the first part of the video, the first part of this series. And if you're confused about how the colonial America worked, you can go and look at the video series that I did about colonial America. But until then, please stay safe and take care.